Chapter 114, Delivering Mountains and Waters to the Chuipot. Fan Xian didn't know how to bargain, but in his previous life, when that pretty little nurse often chatted with him, she would tell him that when a girl buys clothes, she cuts the price from 1/3. Fan Xian wasn't as powerful as the little girl, so he cut the price by 2/5. Who knew that this shopkeeper was actually taking his eyes and glaring at him, and seemed to be very tired of this son's uneducated caliber, covering the box coldly and preparing to take it back to the inner room. Fan Xian was anxious, and opened his mouth to shout at him to come back and discuss the price again. Unexpectedly, Wang Qinian, who had been silent at the side, made a wink to Fan Xian. Fan Xian followed him out with a lonely suspicion. "It's only worth 400 taels. Wang Qinian said to him respectfully, "Your Honor, wait for me to go and ask." After saying this, he re-entered this store without a signboard, and after a while, he re-emerged, only that he already had an extremely verdant snuff bottle in his hand. Only then did he take the 400 taels of silver tickets from Fan Xian's hand and hand them over to the earthy-faced boss behind him. Only after getting into the carriage did Fan Xian say softly, "Don't oppress the good people with your official power." He touched the snuff bottle in his belt and couldn't help but puff out a laugh, but it's also good to bully this kind of treacherous businessman once in a while. Wang Qinian smiled slightly, the wrinkles on the corners of his eyes blossomed like chrysanthemums. After all, he was also a man in his 40s. He explained in a small way, "It's not really a treacherous merchant, it's just that the price he charged for this snuff bottle is only 300 or so taels at most, and we're not bullying him by giving 400 taels. "Oh?" Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian with surprise. Could it be that Lord Wang is actually very proficient in antiques and playthings? Otherwise, how could he see the real price at a glance, knowing that there is a lot of water froth in this line of work? Wang Qinian laughed again and said, "Your Honor, have you forgotten what I was doing before I joined the academy back then?" Fan Xian suddenly realized and said with a laugh, "It turns out that when you were a lone thief back then, you actually learned this knowledge in passing." Wang Qinian responded in embarrassment, "I was peddling around in those small vassal states alone, and didn't dare to ask for help, so naturally I only had to sharpen my eyes on my own." With such a connoisseur in the antique world, no wonder he was able to cut down the price of the snuff bottle so easily earlier. Returning to the front gate of the Fan Mansion, Wang Qinian's squad withdrew, leaving the Fan Mansion to its own protective forces. At this very moment, the wire-drawing screen fan that Fan Xian had ordered in another store before his head also arrived at the gate, and the subordinates hurriedly took it in, only that when the bill was finally handed over, the bookkeeper said to Fan Xian with some pain in his flesh, "Although this fan is good, but it's too expensive, and since the eldest young master bought 5 at once, it's not easy for me to report the bill to the second mistress." Lu happened to walk into the accounting room at this time, and hearing the words of the accountant, she looked at Fan Xian with a smile on her face and nodded her head, "Enter it into the account." Fan Xian smiled faintly and bowed to his aunt, "Good day, aunt." The current situation between the two was too awkward to talk about closeness, and the animosity hadn't yet had a chance to erupt into hostility. Fan Xian was a bit puzzled about something, and asked with a frown, "Auntie, I see that this fan is cool and most comfortable in the hall, but why don't I usually see any families using it?" Lu smiled and shook her head and said, "This is something you will understand better than anyone else later. It's not that the price asked by that merchant is too high, no one can afford to buy it. Summer is just a few days, even if you dig an ice cellar. It's not much more expensive than that fan." Fan Xian wit, a moment to listen to understand, "This is the sale of the inner treasury?" Lu nodded. Fan Xian sighed, "How is it possible to sell it for so much? With this craftsmanship, any merchant could have learned it, so why isn't there another family selling it?" Lu laughed, "Although no one has said anything on the surface, but everyone knows in their hearts that this is the business that the emperor sold to enrich the inner treasury. Who would dare to imitate it? Anyone who lets the supervisory yuan put a name on it is guilty of imprisonment and exile." Fan Xian shook his head, feeling that something was wrong. Lu asked curiously, "Why did you buy 5 at once?" Fan Xian gently explained, "There's one to be placed in the flower hall, one for father and aunt's house, and the other 3 are to be given away. one for King Jing's residence, and one for the Chancellor's residence, and one for the Duke of State's residence. Lu's mother's family is also a large family in the capital. Within 3 generations there was once a Duke of State, so as long as the mention of the Duke of State's house in the fan house, it is referring to the Lu family's Hongi Duke Lu Hung. Lu, slightly stunned, did not think that this beautiful young man will be so thoughtful, not to mention did not think that the other side will take the initiative to show their goodwill. For a moment actually do not know how to respond, slightly lost in thought smiled, and then left the tent. In fact, Fan Xian also saw Lu, only occasionally thought that should turn to return the relationship with the Lu family Lu. If he wanted Fan Xizhi to be firmly on his side in the future, avoiding the scene of a family fight that he disliked very much, then he must make sure that the Lu clan would not once again do something that would make it impossible for the two sides to de-escalate. Small favors, small respect naturally cannot play this kind of effect, so you have to take one step at a time. Fan Xian has this confidence. Lu's a heart divided into 3 pieces. A piece of it belongs to the Sananbo Fan Jian. A piece of it belongs to the Fan Xiqing. As long as the interests of each other can be symbiotically expanded, I think that Lu should not have too many opinions. As for the assassination when he was 12 years old, Fan Xian frowned, forcibly controlling his mind, convincing himself that the Empress and the eldest princess were his true antagonists. In the Chancellor's residence, Lin Ruofu gently stroked the snuff bottle in his hand and said softly, "This is a fine emerald polished into a fine emerald, and the stopper is set by the master of the land coincidentally. But even though it is used for the inner painting, and the painting is good, it seems a bit redundant." Yuan Hongdao was listening on the sidelines, knowing that Lord Chancellor meant what he said. He smiled and said, "A new son-in-law paying a visit to his father-in-law, bringing some gifts is what should be expected." Lin Ruofu smiled faintly, stood up, lifted that square scroll in front of the table with one hand. It turned out to be a painting. The painting is also an old man fishing alone at the riverside. Where the river goes, the end is not visible. The whole scroll is full of ice and snow. Beside the painting is a poem. Thousands of birds flying away from the mountains, 10,000 paths long boat Demoiselle Wang, fishing alone in the cold river snow. Lin Ruofu lightly recited the poem on the painting, sighed. Although the painting is general, calligraphy is not surprising, this poem is not bad. Always heard that Fan Xian is famous for his poems. It is true, just such a poem. Do you still think that he just brought the son-in-law should be the meaning of the son-in-law? Yuan Hongdao smiled bitterly, thinking that this Mr. Fan is really inexplicable. Knowing that the boss lost his son not long ago, the mood has not yet calmed down, but will be so poignant. Poems and paintings to send, a little contemplation. A bright light in front of his eyes said, "Lord, you see here." His finger to a place in the painting. That place to stay white ink. It is the side of the mountain peaks, the side of the cliff, vaguely visible in the snow, 2 very thin light ink line fluttering like a fork, like a small plant to struggle to stand up from the snow. This is it. This is a bit of green from the snowy cliffs of the cold river. Yuan Hongdao explained with a smile. Lin Ruofu looked at the extremely hard-to-spot grass on the painting, his face softening as he said softly, "It seems that even you like this teenager called Fan Xian." Yuan Hongdao did not shy away from anything and said with a smile, "Mr. Fan has a good family background, good talent, and an excellent disposition. In your mouth, he's rather like a perfect man." Lin Ruofu smiled and shook his head. If Chenner can be happy by marrying him, then naturally that's good. Suddenly he lowered his voice and said, "It's just that thing, you can really confirm it?" Yuan Hongdao replied seriously, "That matter at the foot of Tsongshan Mountain has already been confirmed, and I heard that Fei Jie is currently negotiating over at Dongyi City." Lin Ruofu half closed his eyes and said, "I think the same way. In fact, I don't care about Fan Xian's talent and family history, I only care about his disposition and means. As long as the disposition is good and the means are ruthless, in the future, after I die, I will be able to protect our Lin family, and I will be able to protect my only pair of children, and that will be good." After the death of Lin Gong, in fact, the Chancellor of the Lord is indeed some disheartened. The eldest son is a stupid child, daughter is not to see a side for many years, but he still have to rely on their own officials, rely on their own clan to consider the intention. So Lin wanna marry to what kind of person is his current considerations of the most important thing. How is it outside? Lin Ruofu said with a gentle face. It's good, a bit better than what your honor and I imagined. Why is the sky blue? Because the sea is blue. Why is the sea blue? Because the light turns blue when it enters the seawater. Well, don't listen to me, I don't have much research on these things, and I'm basically talking out of my ass. Why is the water in the pool clear, not blue? Because the water in the pool is shallow. Huh? Inside the garden, Lin Wanner's elder brother sat on a rattan chair, his chubby body almost filling up the entire chair, and asked Fan Xian curiously, his eyebrows all filled with the innocence of a child's, with only a few moments of stagnation occasionally showing in his gaze. Fan Xian knew that the eldest son of the Chancellor's residence did not seem to be in good health, but before he came, he had not thought that Wan Er's elder brother was actually a demented child. For some unknown reason, the Prime Minister was slow to receive himself. He himself stayed in the back garden, but happened to bump into his great-uncle and had to accompany him to chat casually. He smiled and thought to himself, wondering if this fat, demented child would occasionally rise up in anger and beat himself up. "What's your name?" Fan Xian smiled as he looked at his demented great-uncle, and after chatting for a while, he realized that the other party was actually just a little slower to react, like a child of a few years of age, and that being silly was somewhat adorable, at least more adorable than Mr. Fan Xicheng, the accountant. Great-uncle flattened his mouth, his chubby cheeks appearing even rounder, the sides of his lips wrinkled up in 2 lines of flesh. "I'm called Debao, my brother is called Erbao, and Erbao hasn't been home for a long time." Fan Xian's heart flinched, thinking of the dead Lin Gong, and in an instant, looking at the silly uncle in front of him, he actually did not know what to say.